Hey everyone! If you're someone who's watching the signs of the times, then you know the question of when is always kind of hanging in the air. Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating prophetic study. It lays out this incredible roadmap to the end days, one that claims the ancient biblical feasts aren't just history, they're a precise, detailed calendar for the events that are to come.
So here's the big question. Could these ancient feasts really be a precise calendar for end times prophecy? The study we're digging into today proposes a very confident yes. It suggests that hidden right inside the structure of these celebrations is a divine timetable for events that many of us believe are getting closer by the day. So let's unpack this.
All right, so the first thing we have to wrap our heads around is something that might sound a little radical at first. It challenges the common understanding of how long the end times actually are. While most of us have heard about a 7-year tribulation, the very foundation of this study is that the entire period is actually a full 14 years.
So think of it like this. The traditional 7-year view mostly comes from focusing on the Gospel of Matthew. But this study argues that's like looking at only one page of a 3-page blueprint for a house. It proposes that Matthew, Mark, and Luke aren't just telling the same story from different angles. Instead, they are distinct prophetic accounts for different groups. And when you lay all 3 pages of the blueprint out together, what you see is a complete, comprehensive 14-year timeline.
Okay, you might be asking, how on earth does a 7-day feast turn into a 7-year timeline? Well, the key that unlocks this is a prophetic principle called days as years. This idea is used all throughout the study, and it basically suggests that when the Bible talks about a feast lasting, say, 7 days, it can prophetically point to a fulfillment that lasts 7 years. This is the mechanism that turns these ancient feasts into a long-term prophetic calendar.
Okay, so once we have that 14-year framework and the days as years idea in our pocket, the study points us straight to Deuteronomy chapter 16. It says that 3 key feasts mentioned there are actually the pillars for this entire end times map.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. We all know the traditional order of the feasts, right? Passover, then Weeks, then Tabernacles. But this study argues the prophetic fulfillment order is flipped on its head. It actually starts with the Feast of Weeks, which represents a pre-tribulation vanishing event. Then, the 7 days of Passover and unleavened bread map onto the first 7 years, the time of the seals. And finally, the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles map to the final 7 years, the time of the trumpet judgments.
And this isn't just pulled out of thin air. The whole idea is anchored right here in Deuteronomy 16. This verse is presented as the clear scriptural foundation for using these 3 specific feasts to map out the different phases of the end days.
But hold on. Before any of this can kick off, the study says there's one critical condition that has to be met. It's like a starting pistol that has to fire first, and the clue is tucked away in the Gospel of Luke.
And that condition is something called the 8th year. The study points to this unique phrasing in Luke chapter 9 about the Transfiguration, where it says it happened about 8 days after. From this, the study concludes that this whole 14-year timeline has to begin in what is prophetically called the 8th year. And this isn't random. It signifies the very first year of a brand new 7-year cycle, a total reset.
All right, so if the starting block is the 8th year, how do we know when the race actually begins? This is where the study gets really specific, with a calculation that connects an ancient harvest festival to the precise moment this whole prophetic calendar gets activated.
Okay, follow the steps here. First, the study looks at the original ancient Feast of Weeks, the actual wheat harvest, which, because of calendar changes over time, now falls around August. Then, it pulls a principle from the Gospel of John, where Jesus says there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest. So, you count back 4 months from that August harvest time, and where do you land? Bam! Right in the middle of the Passover season.
So let's walk through the whole sequence, step by step. It all starts at Passover with that pre-trib vanishing. That event kicks off a 50-day count, which is described as a sort of Acts 2.0 moment of preparation. At the end of those 50 days, the 14-year clock officially starts ticking. It goes all the way through a mid-tribulation event at the 7-year mark, and it all culminates with the Lord's return at the end of year 14, which then kicks off the Great Jubilee cycle. And this, for me, is where all the pieces really click into place. It's the big aha moment of the whole study, and it all comes down to what was actually going on during the Last Supper. What was really happening in that upper room?
I mean, just look at this incredible contrast. In Exodus, God's instructions for the first Passover were super clear. You eat it on your feet, with your shoes on, ready to run. It was a meal of urgent escape. But what do we see in the Gospels? Something totally different. They weren't in a hurry.
They were reclining at a special three-sided table, which was a setting reserved for a celebratory feast, like a wedding.
So keep that picture of them reclining at a special feast in your mind, and listen to this verse from Jesus' parable about a wedding feast in Luke 14. He's giving these very specific instructions about seating arrangements and honor when you're invited to a wedding.
And that is the connection. The study lays out how the scene at the Last Supper, the disciples arguing about who's the greatest, the seating arrangements, the whole vibe, it perfectly mirrors the wedding feast etiquette Jesus describes in Luke 14. The conclusion is just stunning. The Passover meal wasn't just a meal, it was a living, breathing prophecy of the pre-tribulation wedding feast.
Okay, let's take a breath and pull all these threads together. What does all of this mean for us as students of prophecy trying to be prepared for what's ahead?
So, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways here. First, the timeline is proposed to be 14 years, not 7, and it's all mapped out by the feasts. Second, the whole thing has to start in what the study calls the 8th year. Third, that 4-month calculation points right to the Passover season for the kickoff event. And finally, and this is so powerful, the Passover meal itself contains the prophetic blueprint of a wedding feast.
You know, at the end of the day, this study is more than just a calendar. It's a call to be awake, to be prepared. It gives us a map with very specific signs and seasons to watch for. So the real question it leaves us with isn't just if we're watching, but do we know what we're supposed to be watching for? Look, this has been a really quick flyover of a very, very deep study. If you're anything like me, you're going to want to dig into all the scripture and see how these connections are made for yourself. For all the detailed references from the ministry that revealed this, the link to the original video is right down there in the description box. Thanks so much for joining me.